Tonight, welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where ancient stories become gentle dreams. Tonight, welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Instead of kings and battles, we follow Jane Goodall into the forest of Gombe, where patience leaves and the quiet gaze of chimpanzees remind us who we are. Close your eyes and let her gentle story carry you to rest. The air tonight feels thick with the smell of leaves, a mixture of damp earth, and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit clinging to the branch. You imagine yourself stepping softly barefoot into the forest, the soil spongy under your soles. Above you, the canopy blocks the stars, so the night feels endless. A mosquito hums past your ear. You swat lazily, too tired to care much. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this forest, not with snakes coiled in branches or the leopards slipping silently through the undergrowth. But tonight, you don't need to survive. You're only here to drift, to listen, to wander slowly into history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere quiet, I'd love for you to post your location and local time down below. It's always fascinating to see this community spread across continents, almost like a troop of night owls sharing one big digital tree. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle in, as the story doesn't begin with Gombe, or even with the chimps, but with a child. A girl sitting on the floor of a modest English home in the 1930s, nose buried deep in a book. You watch her flip through the pages of Tarzan of the Apes, eyes wide with wonder. She doesn't see the irony that she identifies more with Tarzan's animal companions than with Tarzan himself. She dreams not of adventure as a hero, but of living among wild creatures, understanding their secrets, perhaps even whispering to them. Her name is Jane Goodall. And long before she became the world's most famous primatologist, she was just a girl with too many questions and not enough answers. Her family wasn't wealthy. Her father went off to fight in the war. Her mother raised her with stories and encouragement. But there was always the pull of animals. One day, young Jane took a notebook and a stub of a pencil and crouched in a chicken coop. She wanted to understand how a hen lays an egg. Hours passed. Her mother called out thinking she had disappeared, but Jane sat still patient watching until at last she witnessed the hen settle shift and produce that warm oval miracle. Later, when she rushed to share her discovery, instead of scolding her for vanishing, her mother praised her curiosity. It was the kind of small parental choice that changed history. Many historians still argue whether great scientists are born or made, but here you see the making of one. The quirky part: Jane was given a stuffed chimpanzee toy as a child named Jubilee. Most children might have been frightened by its leathery face and long arms, but Jane adored it. She carried Jubilee everywhere, even into bed. And though a toy can't truly spark destiny, you can't help but smile at the coincidence: a child clutching a chimp one day, destined to change the world's view of chimps. You close your eyes a little tighter, hearing the crackle of the old radio in that English house, the faint wartime news bulletins, the rationing, the quiet determination of a family enduring. Amid all that, a girl was dreaming of Africa. She promised herself someday she would get there. Someday she would step into the forests she had only imagined. Of course, travel wasn't easy. Britain in the post-war years wasn't exactly handing out tickets to adventure. Young women were expected to become secretaries, nurses, maybe teachers. Jane did become a secretary for a while, her neat handwriting and quiet focus serving her well. But the dream never faded. When she was invited by a friend to visit Kenya, she worked as a waitress to save enough money for the voyage. Picture her carrying trays of tea and biscuits in a cafe, probably smiling politely at customers who had no idea they were being served by a future icon of science. There's something gently funny in imagining that scene. The clumsy clatter of cups, a saucer nearly toppling Jane's mind, already far away in the imagined forests of Africa, while someone impatiently asks for more sugar. You can almost hear her sigh inwardly, thinking, if only you knew what I really want to do. And then finally, the chance came. She traveled by boat, yes, an actual boat, because air travel was rare and costly then. The sea stretched endlessly, and you imagine her leaning on the railing, hair-blowing stomach unsettled from the waves, but eyes full of anticipation. Across the water lay Africa. Across the water lay the first step toward Gombe. Mainstream historians point out that this journey was unusual. Few women of that time made such leaps into science. But Jane wasn't yet a scientist. She was just a determined young woman, willing to listen, to watch, to wait. That quality patience would become her greatest tool. More valuable than any microscope or textbook. As you drift in this memory, the forest around you rustles. A breeze carries the scent of banana leaves mingling with the salt tang of the ocean she once crossed. You almost hear the faint scratch of her pencil on paper, jotting notes, wondering, preparing. You probably smile at the thought, a young woman with no degree, no training, no credentials, but with a fierce curiosity and a stuffed chimpanzee toy back home. Scholars still argue whether passion is enough without formal training. Yet history shows you sometimes it is. Jane Goodall didn't wait for permission to care, to watch, to dream. She simply followed the quiet pull that had begun in childhood with chickens and toy chimps and stories of Tarzan, and so the scene closes gently. You see the outline of a young girl's dream stretching forward across decades, the sound of leaves brushing together like hands in applause, and the distant call of a chimpanzee echoing into your imagination. The journey to Africa has only just begun, and you are drifting along with it, step by slow step. You lean forward now as the ship approaches the eastern coast of Africa. The sky is washed with a haze of pink and orange, the kind of sunrise that feels too generous to describe. You smell the salt air thickening with something unfamiliar. Spices, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of tropical blossoms carried on the breeze. For Jane Goodall, this is the moment her dream tilts into reality. For you, drifting in the softness of memory, it feels like stepping into a storybook that has quietly waited for your arrival. The ship pulls into Mombasa, the Kenyan port, bustling with movement. Dockworkers shout, children weave between stalls, and the sound of drums mingles with the clatter of crates. You stand on the deck beside Jane, your fingers gripping the railing. She's 23 years old, slender, determined, and holding a notebook as though it's the only tool she'll ever need. She's not a scientist yet, not by any formal standard, but she's exactly where she has longed to be, Africa. She doesn't linger in Mombasa. Her real destination lies inland to Nairobi, where she will meet a man who will change her life, Louis Leakey. The famous paleoanthropologist, already deep into his search for the earliest humans, is intrigued by this quiet young woman who speaks more of patience than of prestige. He has been looking for observers, for fresh eyes unclouded by academic dogma. And here stands Jane, notebook ready, heart steady, willing to sit for hours watching animals most scholars dismissed as little more than noisy shadows. Imagine the meeting Leakey with his pipe, his eyes sharp, explaining his belief that by studying chimpanzees, humans might glimpse their own evolutionary past. Jane listens, nods. Perhaps scribbles a note, though inside her thoughts are humming like cicadas. She is ready. Leaky decides she is the one to send to Gombe, a remote region in what was then Tanganyika, now Tanzania. It isn't simple. Funding must be arranged. Government permits must be granted. And because the idea of a young woman living alone in the forest scandalizes officials, Jane must find a companion. Her mother Van steps forward, calm, supportive, perhaps secretly nervous, but willing to live in the wild alongside her daughter until the authorities are reassured. That detail alone is quirky enough to soften your heart, a British mother packing her bags to camp among chimpanzees, not because she craves adventure, but because she believes in her daughter. You smile at the image mother and daughter, lugging crates, mosquito nets, notebooks, and tinned food up muddy trails into a forest buzzing with insects. You probably wouldn't survive the packing list alone. The journey to Gombe is slow. You move with them by train, the wheels clacking through landscapes that shift from savanna to lush hillsides. Herds of cattle graze. Children wave at the train. The air grows heavier green with moisture. And finally, after days, you reach the edge of Lake Tanganyika, its waters shimmering like melted silver beneath the sun. Across the lake lies the Gombe Stream Reserve. There are no hotels, no convenient paths, only forest, thick and waiting. You climb into a small boat with Jane and her mother, the water lapping gently against the sides. Fishermen pass their nets heavy, their songs carrying across the lake. The boat cuts toward shore. Behind you, the horizon blurs with heat. Ahead of you, the forest rises dense and secretive, its canopy like an unopened book. Historians still argue whether Leakey chose Jane purely for her observational skills, or because he believed her lack of academic training made her less biased. Some even say he wanted to challenge the scientific establishment with someone unexpected, a young woman who wouldn't play by the rigid rules. Whatever his reasons, you are here now drifting with Jane toward the forest that will define her life. The camp is basic. A canvas tent, a few supplies, a kettle for boiling water. The ground is uneven. The nights are loud with insect choruses and the occasional cry of something larger hidden in the dark. Jane notes it all, scribbling by lantern light. Her handwriting neat, even as moths flutter dangerously close to the flame. Her mother offers quiet comfort, telling stories to local guides, encouraging Jane not to lose faith when the chimps remain distant shadows. Because that's the truth in the beginning. The chimps are shy. They vanish at the first rustle of grass, the first hint of human scent. Days stretch into weeks. Jane sits with binoculars, heart-aching patience tested. She knows she must not push too close. Instead, she lingers on ridges, peering across gullies, recording glimpses of fur, a quick movement in the canopy, the crack of fruit shells against bark. It is painstaking work, and for many unbearably boring. But Jane is steady, almost stubborn. She believes trust takes time. At night, you listen with her to the forest symphony. Frogs croak in overlapping rhythms. Owls hoot their calls, rising like questions. The wind shakes the trees, and somewhere deep, you hear the drumming of chimpanzee fists against hollow roots, a sound like distant thunder. The forest isn't empty, it's simply cautious. And here's your first light joke of the night. While Jane waits quietly for hours, you half asleep in this story would have lasted maybe 10 minutes before wandering off in search of snacks. Good thing Jane's patience doesn't match yours. Still, it isn't all seriousness. Jane finds small joys in the daily routine: tea, brewed strong enough to chase off the damp sketching leaves in the margins of her notebook, watching troop after troop of red colobus monkeys scamper overhead. quirky detail, she often sat so still that small birds landed near her, as if mistaking her for part of the scenery. And in those quiet moments, you sense the depth of her character. She isn't driven by prestige, nor by the hope of fame. She is driven by wonder. Each sound is a clue, each movement, a piece of a puzzle older than humanity itself. As the section draws you deeper, the lake's surface glimmers under the moonlight. The campfire crackles low, casting long shadows. You imagine Jane lying on her cot mosquito net, draped notebook clutched beside her pillow. Her eyes heavy, but her mind alive with anticipation. She doesn't yet know what discovery lies ahead, but she feels it, like the forest is holding its breath, waiting to reveal a secret that will ripple through science. And so you linger there halfway between dream and waking, listening to the night sounds with her. The forest, the lake, the quiet patience of a young woman just beginning her journey. Morning slides softly into the camp, the lake shining like a sheet of glass beneath the rising sun. Mist clings to the treetops, and you hear the steady hum of insects greeting the day. You rub your eyes, stretch your arms, and imagine yourself stepping out of the tent beside Jane Goodall binoculars slung around your neck, notebook tucked beneath your arm. Today is another day of waiting, another day of watching, another day where nothing dramatic might happen at all, and yet every hour is thick with quiet promise. Jane begins her climb up the ridges overlooking the Gombe Stream Reserve. The earth is damp, your boots slip a little, and vines tug playfully at your ankles. Birds chatter overhead in bursts of color, Taraco's hornbills, and the occasional fish eagle swooping low across the lake. The forest is alive, and yet you feel the tug of frustration. The chimpanzees remain distant. They vanish at the faintest sound, leaving only the trace of broken branches and fruit husks behind. Jane knows she cannot chase them. She must simply sit. And so you lower yourself with her onto a rock outcrop, tucking your legs beneath you, lifting the binoculars and scanning the trees for movement. Hours pass like this, marked only by the shifting shadows of clouds. Sometimes the forest feels like it is testing you. How still can you be? How quiet? How patient? You realize quickly that you are not cut out for this. A mosquito lands on your arm, and you slap it, ruining your disguise. Jane, though, sits steady, scratching notes onto her pad, recording even the smallest details. This is the rhythm of her early days in Gombe silent patience. It sounds uneventful, but in truth, it was revolutionary. At that time, scientists often studied animals in laboratories, cages, or zoos, where behavior was stripped of its context. Jane insisted on the opposite. She wanted to watch chimps in their natural home without interference. Historians still argue whether this outsider's patience was genius or naivete. What's certain is that her approach broke the mold. As you sit there with her, you notice the sounds of the forest sharpening. Leaves rustle not just with wind, but with movement. A branch bounces. A faint hoot echoes low and resonant, carried across the canopy. Your breath catches, though Jane remains calm. She lifts her binoculars and steadies her gaze. Yes, their fur dark against the green. A chimpanzee, cautious, half-hidden eyes, gleaming with suspicion. He doesn't stay long. Within moments, he melts back into the leaves, leaving only silence in his wake. You can't help but chuckle at the thought you've waited 3 hours for a 2-second glimpse. It's like buying tickets to a concert, only to see the curtain lift and fall again. But Jane isn't disappointed. She smiles, faintly writes down adult male wary disappeared quickly. For her, even a few seconds is progress. Night falls again, and the same cycle repeats. Sit, wait, scribble, listen. The routine would crush the spirit of most, but Jane thrives on it. Quirky details she often hummed softly to herself while waiting a tuneless melody to keep her focus steady. You imagine yourself beside her trying not to laugh when the song drifts into a rhythm suspiciously, like God Save the Queen. Patience, however, has a way of reshaping you. By the second week, the chimps no longer vanish quite so quickly. They watch from a distance, eyes dark, weighing her intent. Jane makes no sudden movements, offers no food demands, nothing. She is simply present. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boundary begins to soften. One morning you follow Jane to a clearing. She sits quietly on a fallen log. The air is heavy with the smell of figs, their juices dripping onto the ground. A group of chimps approaches cautious but curious. They linger at the edges of the clearing, peering at her with tilted heads. One scratches his chest, another yawns, showing off a mouthful of teeth. You freeze, but Jane remains perfectly still. She writes in her notebook proximity closer than before. It's progress again. And here's the joke for tonight. You try to mimic Jane's stillness, but your stomach growls loud enough to scare a squirrel. Patience is not your strength. Good thing Jane doesn't rely on your help. By now, Jane has become a fixture of the forest. She sits in the same places each day, her presence less alien to the chimps. She begins to recognize individuals, noticing scars, fur patterns, and subtle differences in posture. She doesn't yet name them, though. That moment is coming. But she senses that each chimp is not just a shadow in the trees. Each one is a personality waiting to be revealed. Mainstream history points to these weeks as the foundation of her method. Where others might have pushed too hard, she allowed the chimps to come to her. And in doing so, she set the stage for a discovery that would rewrite the boundary between human and animal. But for now, it is only waiting, only scribbles, only long hours of quiet beneath the canopy. As the section closes, the light fades to dusk. You hear the drumming again? Chimps pounding on hollow roots, a sound that echoes like thunder rolling through the hills. It vibrates in your chest, primal and strange. Jane listens too, her expression serene, as if she knows the forest is whispering secrets, and she only needs to wait a little longer for them to be revealed. The morning begins with mist rising off Lake Tanganyika, the air carrying a cool dampness that clings to your skin. You breathe in the earthy smell of wet leaves, the faint sweetness of guava, and the acrid bite of wood smoke from a small cooking fire back at camp. Jane Goodall climbs another ridge, her binoculars dangling against her chest, her notebook pressed beneath one arm. You follow, feeling your legs ache. The forest feels endless, each path twisting into green shadows. But Jane moves with steady purpose. Today, like all days, she expects nothing and everything. Patience is the rhythm. By now, weeks have blurred together in silence. Chimps have grown used to her figure in the distance. Some linger longer before melting back into the canopy. A few boulders shift, closer, peering at her from behind branches. But still, the hours tick on, filled with nothing more dramatic than the cracking of nuts or the distant hoot echoing down the valley. Then one afternoon it happens. You sit beside Jane on a slope overlooking a tangle of termite mounds. The air buzzes with insect life and the sun filters through leaves, sketching shifting patterns across the ground. A chimp approaches. His name will one day be famous, David Greybeard. But to Jane in this moment, he is just another silhouette, moving with slow confidence. His fur is silvery around the muzzle, his gaze cautious, but not afraid. Jane steadies her binoculars, breath held. David pauses at the mound. He glances around, then plucks a slender twig from a nearby branch. With surprising precision, he strips the leaves away, shaping it into a tool. You blink, thinking you imagined it. But no. He pushes the stick into the termite mound, waits a moment, and draws it out covered in squirming insects. He lifts it to his mouth lips, closing delicately, savoring his catch. History pivots quietly. You shift in disbelief, almost wanting to shout, but Jane remains composed, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Her hand shakes, through the line of her script wobbling slightly. For the first time, she has evidence that chimpanzees are not merely tool users, but tool makers, stripping branches to fashion them into something new. That small difference collapses a wall scientists had long built between humans and animals. Mainstream textbooks of the time insisted that toolmaking defined humanity. Man the toolmaker was the tidy phrase. Now, with one chimp and one stick, the phrase no longer holds. Historians still argue whether it was truly the first recorded instance or whether others had observed it, but not recognized its significance. But it is Jane's observation that made the world listen. The quirky part of this story, Jane's first report, was dismissed by some scientists as naive. They insisted she must have been mistaken, that the chimps were simply playing. Others scoffed that she anthropomorphized, seeing meaning where none existed. Yet when National Geographic sent a photographer, Hugo van Lawick, to document her work, the evidence became undeniable. There on film were chimps shaping twigs and dipping them into termite mounds. Proof crisp and irrefutable. Imagine that camera shutter clicking softly, the film rolling while David Greybeard calmly fished for termites. Meanwhile, Jane crouched a few feet away, her heart hammering, trying not to smile too wide. And you, drifting in the story, realize you are witnessing a shift as large as Galileo pointing his telescope at the stars, or Darwin watching finches in the Galapagos. Except this shift involves termites, a stick, and a chimp, who probably has no idea he just rewrote humanity's definition of itself. You stifle a laugh at the thought, all of civilization, philosophy, and science undone by a chimp with better DIY skills than you have on a Saturday afternoon. If you were stranded in the forest, you'd probably starve before figuring out termite cuisine. David, however, snacks like a gourmet. From this moment on, everything changes. Jane no longer sees shadows in the trees. She sees intelligence, creativity, culture. Each chimp is not just an animal, but a window into what humanity once was. She begins to push aside the rigid rules of science. Where others number their subjects, she gives them names. Where others dismiss emotion, she records tenderness, rivalry, even grief. The discovery of tool use isn't just about sticks and termites. It's about granting chimps a new place in the story of life. At night back at camp, Jane writes by lantern glow, her words steady now despite the excitement. She records every detail, the twig, the stripping, the waiting, the eating. She writes it again and again, afraid that history might erase the moment if she doesn't anchor it in ink. Her mother listens quietly, smiling, perhaps not fully grasping the enormity, but understanding her daughter's joy. Scholars debate still, was tool use truly unique to chimps and humans? Or do other animals craft tools in ways we haven't noticed? Crows bend wires. Sea otters crack shells with stones. Dolphins use sponges to protect their snouts while foraging. The definition of tool stretches like vines, and the line between human and animal blurs further. But in the mid-20th century, Jane's observation is nothing short of explosive. As you drift towards sleep, you picture David Greybeard under the green canopy termite, stick in hand, chewing contentedly. A simple act, yet one that shook the foundations of science. The forest seems to exhale as if satisfied that a secret has finally been shared. Jane, notebook in hand, closes her eyes for a moment, smiling faintly. She knows the world will never see chimps the same way again. And neither will you. The forest breathes with a rhythm of its own. Morning light filters through the canopy in long slanted beams, painting patches of gold on the damp soil. You sit once more on the ridge with Jane Goodall binoculars, warm from her steady hand's notebook already open. Today, though, she isn't just waiting for shadows. She's waiting for someone familiar. Someone whose silver muzzle has already carved itself into her memory. David Graybeard. He is the first chimpanzee who stops running from her. The first who lingers without fear, who lets his dark eyes meet hers without darting away. To Jane, this is not just observation. It feels like the beginnings of a relationship. She writes in her journal with unusual tenderness, describing his calm presence, his gentle movements. And here you realize David Graybeard isn't just another chimp. He is the bridge. The name itself, quirky, even charming, comes from that patch of white-gray fur around his chin, like an old man who forgot to shave. Jane could have labeled him male number 6 or specimen A, as scientists of the time preferred. But she chose instead to give him a name, an identity, a dignity. Historians still argue whether this was unscientific or profoundly human. What's certain is that David Graybeard became more than data. He became a symbol. You watch him climb a fig tree with ease, his movements precise and fluid. He breaks a branch, not just for food, but to fashion a tool, dipping it again into the termite mound. Each action is deliberate, measured, confident. Around him, the younger chimps watch, imitating clumsily. Culture in the making. You think of knowledge passed not by instinct, but by example. That detail alone shakes the foundations of human exceptionalism, and then one day something happens that leaves Jane in awe. She sits quietly sketching leaves in the margin of her notes when David Graybeard approaches her camp. He is cautious, but not afraid. He stretches out his hand, not for food, but simply in recognition. Jane offers a banana. His fingers brush hers, leathery and warm. For the first time, human and chimp share touch, not as predator and prey, not as master and captive, but as companions meeting in trust. You feel your breath catch. The forest holds still, as though every leaf is aware of the moment. Jane later writes that tears pricked her eyes, not because of the banana, but because of the trust behind it. This was no longer about observation. It was about connection. Of course, not everyone is convinced. Some scholars argue that feeding chimps altered their behavior, that this bond skewed the data. Others believe that the emotional tone Jane brought to her research blurred the line between science and sentiment. Yet without that banana, without that hand, perhaps the chimps would never have accepted her presence enough to reveal their true lives. The quirky twist here, David Graybeard became something of a celebrity, even in his own troop. When other chimps saw him interact with Jane without fear, their curiosity grew. Slowly, cautiously, they began to inch closer, emboldened by his calm. He was not just her first breakthrough. He was the ambassador of his species. At camp, Jane would speak of him often, her voice soft, as if describing an old friend. You picture her by the lantern jotting David Graybeard, gentle, not hostile, while her mother listens, nodding. Hugo Van Lowick, the photographer later sent by National Geographic, captures him in crisp images, the silver chin, the dark eyes, the twig in hand. The world will soon know his face, but tonight in this sleepy story, it feels like only you and Jane are watching him beneath the canopy. And here comes tonight's little joke. If Jane had named him Chimpanzee number 6, Imagine trying to tell that story to the world. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Specimen 6, Who Changed History. Doesn't quite inspire awe, does it? Good thing she went with something more poetic. In time, David Greybeard's legacy grows. His tool use, his calm demeanor, his role in bridging two species, all become pillars of Jane's discoveries. He proves what she always suspected, that chimpanzees are not mere shadows of humanity, but kin with culture, emotion, and intelligence. When David Greybeard eventually disappears back into the forest, Jane feels the absence deeply. She writes of him with reverence, almost grief. For her, he was not just an observation point. He was a companion who unlocked the forest's greatest secret. Scholars may still debate whether naming him broke the rules of science, but lying here listening to the night sounds of Gombuno rules are only part of the story. Sometimes science needs a little tenderness to reveal its truths, and so the memory of David Greybeard lingers like the last light of dusk on the lake. His hand reaching for a twig, his eyes steady, his chin silver against the shadows. The chimp who changed history, the ambassador who carried Jane, and perhaps all of humanity one step closer to understanding itself. The air feels heavier now, thick with the weight of revelation. You sit with Jane by the dim glow of a lantern, listening to the rustle of the forest as she flips back through her notebook. Each page is a record of patience, rewarded each line a quiet rebellion against what the world believed. For centuries, the story had been simple: humans were unique. Humans used tools. Humans had culture. And then David Greybeard dipped a twig into a termite mound, and the story cracked open. Imagine the headlines rippling across scientific circles. A young woman in a canvas tent, no degree, no PhD, no official title, yet claiming to have seen chimps fashioning tools. Many scholars stiffened their brows, furrowed. Could it be true? Some muttered that her inexperience made her naive, too ready to see intelligence where there was none. Others dismissed her because she named her subjects, because she wrote of personalities instead of specimens. Still, the photos came, and the film reels followed, and the evidence left little room for doubt. Mainstream history tells you this was the moment science had to rewrite its definitions. If humans were not the only tool makers, then what truly set them apart? Language, culture, fire. Each idea slipped further from certainty, like vines pulling at old walls until they collapsed. Historians still argue whether Jane's discovery was the single spark that ignited a broader shift, or just one part of a larger pattern in which animals steadily reclaimed their complexity. But no matter the debate, her termite stick had become a wedge in the door of human exceptionalism. Jane herself remained calm amid the noise. She wasn't there to topple egos. She was there to listen to chimps. Yet even she must have smiled gently at the thought of entire textbooks being rewritten because of a few patient afternoons on a ridge. It's a quirky detail to picture professors in dusty lecture halls stumbling over their own words. Man the tool maker. Well, except for chimps, apparently. Somewhere you imagine Jane scribbling in her notebook with a small grin, while far away a scholar spits tea onto his notes in disbelief. The shift went beyond tools. Jane described the chimps as affectionate, quarrelsome, playful, strategic. They kissed, embraced, held hands. They comforted one another after fights. They also schemed, fought, and yes, sometimes killed. The full spectrum of behavior once reserved for humanity revealed itself in the canopy. Each note Jane wrote chipped away at the wall of separation. And here's tonight's light joke. You think of all the effort humans have put into building fancy gadgets, smartphones, electric cars, drones, and meanwhile chimps are content with sticks and termites. Who's really winning the efficiency contest? Of course, critics accused her of anthropomorphism, the cardinal sin of science, seeing human traits in animals. But Jane insisted it was the opposite. Humans had simply refused to see animal traits in themselves. The debate still ripples through academia. Was she blurring lines, or was she finally erasing an artificial divide? Either way, her notebooks carried more than data. They carried a quiet insistence that humility was overdue. The ripple effect touched anthropology as well. If chimps could make tools, then our own ancestors might not have been so exceptional. Leakey himself famously remarked, "Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans." That sentence alone unsettled centuries of philosophy. It pushed archaeologists to re-examine artifacts, to question assumptions about what counted as human behavior. The termite stick reached all the way back into prehistory, muddying categories with the persistence of termites themselves. In Gum, though, things remain simple. Jane rose each day, climbed the ridges, and watched. The chimps drummed on roots, groomed each other, fought, and reconciled. David Greybeard appeared now and then, calm as ever. Jane noted it all, her patience unbroken by the distant rumble of scientific debate. To her, these weren't discoveries in the sense of trophies. They were observations of neighbors, friends, kin. By night under the stars, you feel the weight of it too. The forest hums with life, and you realize that the line between human and animal is thinner than the paper of Jane's notebook. Perhaps you think the real uniqueness of humans is not in tool use or intelligence, but in the stubborn belief that uniqueness must exist at all. Your eyelids grow heavy as you drift with that thought. The termites march on, the chimps continue their routines, and Jane's lantern burns low. In this quiet, you sense the future of science, bending ever so slightly, a path redrawn not by a laboratory or a grand lecture, but by a silver-chinned chimp and the patience of a young woman who refused to look away. The days stretch long in Gombe, each one beginning with mist drifting off the lake and ending with crickets rising into a steady chorus. You walk beside Jane Goodall notebook pressed to your chest as she follows the familiar trails through the forest. By now, the chimps are no longer just fleeting shadows. They are individuals, each with quirks, tempers, and stories. And Jane, unlike most scientists of her time, dares to call them by name. David Greybeard, of course, comes first. His calm presence still lingers in your thoughts, silver muzzle catching the light. But then there are others, Goliath strong and dominant, Ollie playful and bold, Mr. McGregor with his wary eyes and nervous movements, and then Flo the aging matriarch with her ragged ears, and Flint, her clingy infant, who clutches her like a shadow. Jane names them because to her they are not specimens, not numbers scribbled on data sheets. They are beings with character. She notices how Goliath struts, how Ollie teases, how Flo soothes her infant with gentle touches. She writes of them as though they are neighbors, not research subjects. The scientific world bristles. Unscientific, some say. Anthropomorphic, others sneer. They argue that names bring bias, that personality is projection, that animals must remain statistics to be valid. Historians still argue whether Jane's method opened the door to a richer science or slipped into sentimentality. But as you sit with her on a ridge, watching Flo patiently groom another female, you sense the truth numbers could never capture this. A quirky detail floats into memory. Jane sometimes sketched little faces beside her notes, capturing a furrowed brow or a crooked ear. They weren't works of art, just quick impressions like doodles in the margin. Imagine a future professor flipping through her field notes, pausing at a stick figure chimp with a giant eyebrow, muttering, This is not how we were taught to document data. Yet those doodles carried more life than a sterile label ever could. You follow Jane into a clearing where Ollie chases another young chimp, both hooting with laughter-like sounds rolling in the grass. They pause, look toward Jane, and then dash off again, as though inviting her into the game. She smiles her pen, scratching Ollie playful mischievous. And you laugh softly, realizing that your notes would probably read chimp chaos level maximum. By naming them, Jane also notices patterns others might miss. Flo's patience with Flint, Goliath's occasional kindness despite his size, David's role as a calming presence in tense moments. She begins to see society in miniature, a world of alliances, hierarchies, friendships, and grudges. It is as complex as any village, and perhaps more honest. The mainstream historical fact is this: before Jane, most scientists insisted on numbering animals to avoid bias. But after Jane, the tide began to shift. More researchers recognized individuality, and the idea of animal personality became harder to dismiss. Today, the names of Flo Flint and David Greybeard are as famous in primatology as Darwin's finches in biology. Here comes tonight's light joke. You think about how humans give names to cars, plants, even sourdough starters. But once upon a time, calling a chimp David Greybeard instead of Subject 6 was considered radical. If your potted cactus can have a name, surely Flo deserves hers. Still, the debate continues. Scholars argue whether naming crosses the line into empathy that clouds judgment. But as you sit there hearing the rhythmic grooming sounds, the click of nails through fur, the soft sigh of relaxation, you realize science is not just about distance. Sometimes it takes closeness to reveal the truth. Night falls. You sit near the campfire, Jane jotting her notes by lantern glow. The names float softly in the air like friends around a dinner table. Goliath, Ollie, Mr. McGregor, Flo, Flint. Each one a thread in the tapestry of Gombe. Each one a reminder that science isn't just about measuring, it's about noticing. And Jane, in her gentle defiance, has chosen to notice more deeply than most ever dared. You lean back, listening to the forest pulse around you, and smile faintly. Numbers fade in the dark, but names linger. And in the hush of the night, it feels right that they should. The forest of Gombe hums steadily, yet far away another sound builds the murmur of doubt. Not from the chimps, who seem increasingly at ease with Jane's quiet presence, but from the world beyond the trees. You sit by her side, listening as she recounts letters arriving from London, from New York, from professors with heavy titles and heavier skepticism. What she has seen, they say, is impossible, or at the very least, suspicious. Imagine it: a young woman, no formal scientific degree, sitting on a hillside in Tanzania, claiming to have witnessed chimps making tools showing personalities forming societies. The scientific establishment bristled. This wasn't how data was supposed to look. Research was supposed to be objective, sterile, stripped of emotion. Yet here was Jane speaking of David Greybeard, with fondness describing Flo's patience, Ollie's mischief, Flint's clinginess. To her critics, this sounded more like children's storytelling than hard science. You picture an academic conference somewhere in the 1960s. Men in stiff suits, slides clicking on projectors, voices droning about data sets. Then comes Jane's findings, described in her gentle tone, filled with names and anecdotes. Some scholars shift uncomfortably in their seats. Others roll their eyes. Historians still argue whether their resistance was about methodology, sexism, or simply the shock of ideas that rattled their worldview. Perhaps it was all three, yet not everyone dismissed her. Louis Leakey championed her, insisting that her outsider's perspective was precisely what allowed her to see clearly. National Geographic funded her, sending Hugo van Lawick to photograph and film. And soon undeniable images began circulating. David Greybeard, with his termite stick Flo, grooming Flint chimps, embracing tenderly. The evidence was no longer just in her notebooks. It was in the flicker of film reels shown across the world. Quirky details, some of those early films, had to be carried out of Gombe by boat, carefully packed in metal canisters, guarded like treasure. Imagine balancing on the lake's edge, hoping the evidence of tool use doesn't sink into Tanganyika's depths with one careless slip. You chuckle softly, thinking how modern researchers just upload files to the cloud. Jane and Hugo, by contrast, literally risked sinking science at the bottom of a lake. Still, the debates raged. Were chimps truly making tools or just manipulating objects? Was naming them a violation of scientific neutrality or a recognition of reality? Was Jane projecting emotions onto them or uncovering emotions long denied? Journals filled with arguments, some sharp, some cautious. Conferences echoed with heated discussions. Scholars still argue whether Jane's approach represented a breakthrough or a betrayal of scientific rigor. Meanwhile, in Gombe, the chimps went about their lives. They didn't care for debates or definitions. They groomed, they fought, they played, they mourned. Jane wrote it all, steady hand, patient eye. She knew that time was on her side. The longer she stayed, the more the chimps revealed. And the more they revealed, the harder it became to dismiss her observations. Here's tonight's light joke. You can't help but imagine one of those skeptical professors standing in the forest for just 10 minutes before giving up swatting mosquitoes and muttering, "This is nonsense." Meanwhile, Jane sat for months unblinking. While you know you'd be begging for a hammock and a cold drink within the hour, the skepticism, though, had its strange benefits. It forced Jane to sharpen her notes, to gather more detail, to anticipate every criticism. She didn't just write that David Greybeard used a tool. She described the twig, the stripping, the waiting, the eating, again and again, like a lawyer building an airtight case. Each page became a fortress against dismissal. Eventually, the fortress held. By the late 1960s, Jane's work was no longer a curiosity. It was a cornerstone of primatology. The very same professors who once scoffed now cited her. Universities that had doubted offered her honorary degrees. Students studied her methods as models. And David Greybeard's name, once considered unscientific, became a legend in the history of science. As night drapes itself across the forest, you listen to Jane's quiet voice as she reflects on those early struggles. She doesn't gloat, doesn't rail against the skeptics. She only smiles faintly and says patience is rewarded, whether with chimps or with people. You lean back against the earth, the hum of insects rising, and feel the calm certainty of her words. The debates may echo endlessly in halls far away, but here in Gombe, the truth has already spoken through the silence of waiting. The forest has become your second skin now. Each morning you wake to the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke, the sound of birds shrieking and insects humming. Gombe no longer feels foreign. It feels alive with patterns you almost expect. Jane Goodall moves through it with calm certainty, carrying her binoculars, her notebook, and her patience like everyday tools. You follow her steps along narrow trails carved by both humans and animals, your shoes catching on roots, your arms brushing tall ferns. This is life in Gombe, steady, quiet, demanding. There are joys, of course. The lake gleams like polished silver at dawn, and sometimes, if the air is still enough, it mirrors the sky so perfectly You feel as if you are walking through a doorway into another world. At night, the stars pour across the sky in torrents, more than you've ever seen, each one shimmering with the faint hiss of the insect chorus. And then there are the chimps moments when they forget to be wary, when they play squabble, or simply lounge in the branches above, reminding you that life in all its forms is ordinary and extraordinary at once. Jane delights in the small details. She records not just the tool use or dominance displays, but the way a mother rocks her infant, the rhythm of grooming, the laughter-like sounds of youngsters chasing each other through the grass. Quirky detail, Jane sometimes carried bananas not just as food, but as peace offerings. At first, they helped coax chimps closer, though later she would regret the practice, realizing it altered behavior. She admitted the mistake openly, another way her honesty reshaped field science. But the challenges weigh heavy too. Mosquitoes swarm endlessly, biting through fabric. Tsetse flies leave welts that itch for days. Food spoils quickly in the damp heat, and supplies from outside are irregular at best. Illness creeps in: malaria infections, fevers. Jane endures them with quiet resilience, her mother's early support still echoing in her mind even after she returns home. Mainstream history records that this period forged Jane's strength. While other researchers relied on teams' equipment and rigid schedules, she lived simply, depending on patience more than instruments. Historians still argue whether her methods thrived because of hardship or despite it. Was the loneliness a gift sharpening her focus? Or was it a burden she endured with quiet grit? Life in Gombe was not without danger. Leopards prowled the forest edges, though rarely seen. Once, Jane heard the shrill alarm of chimps as they spotted a predator, their hoots rising in frantic unison. She froze, heart pounding, but nothing emerged. Perhaps it was only shadows, or perhaps it was one of the forest's great cats watching silently from the branches. You smile faintly at the thought you'd have bolted immediately, tripping over every root in sight, while Jane simply steadied her notebook. Despite hardship, there was joy in routine. Each morning she packed tea in a thermos, biscuits in a tin, and climbed the ridges. Each evening she returned, scribbling pages of notes by firelight. Some days brought nothing more than distant glimpses of dark fur. Other days brought laughter, play, or even sorrow, like the time she saw a mother lose her infant, cradling the body for days before letting go. Science recorded it as behavior. Jane felt it as grief, and always there were the fishermen on the lake. Their songs carried across the water in the evenings, voices rising in rhythmic cadence as nets were hauled in. Jane wrote that the sound comforted her, a reminder that human life pulsed nearby, even as she drifted deeper into the world of chimps. Quirky aside, she sometimes traded for fish to supplement camp meals, though her cooking skills were modest at best. Imagine a future world-famous scientist burning fish over an open fire, muttering under her breath while the chimps feasted contentedly in the trees above. As you lie back in the forest, with her notebook pages fluttering in the breeze, you sense that this life is as fragile as it is profound. Supplies could fail, health could falter, research could collapse, yet it is precisely the fragility that makes each day shimmer with importance. Nothing is guaranteed, and so every note matters. The forest grows darker now, shadows pooling under the trees, the lake stretching silent and wide. The chimps call to one another in the distance, their voices rising like echoes of a forgotten language. Jane closes her notebook, brushing a strand of hair from her face, her smile soft but tired. She has lived another day in Gombe, joy and hardship, laughter and loneliness, all written into the story. You close your eyes, letting the night carry you, the sound of insects rising like waves, the image of chimps playing still fresh in your mind. This is life in Gombera, relentless and beautiful. The forest has given you more than notes. It has given you stories that reach far beyond Gombe. You sit with Jane Goodall by the fire, the notebook on her lap, thick with months of observations. Pages filled with David Greybeard's calm flow's patience. Flint's clinging hands, Ollie's playful bursts. These stories are no longer secrets kept by the trees. Soon, they will belong to the world. National Geographic's support transforms Jane's solitude into something larger. Hugo van Lawick, the photographer, arrives with his camera, capturing the intimacy Jane has been describing. You imagine the two of them walking the same ridges you have, pausing in silence. Hugo raising his lens while Jane jots notes. His photos will show the chimp's eyes shining, their fingers delicate, their gestures startlingly human. The world, which once doubted her words, will now see with its own eyes. The images spread. Film reels roll in lecture halls. Magazine pages glow with black and white portraits of chimps staring back at readers. And Jane herself, shy but steady, begins to speak not just to scientists, but to ordinary people. She doesn't thunder with authority. She speaks gently in the same voice she uses when describing Flo's grooming or David's termite stick. And people listen, leaning in closer, as though they too are crouched with her in the undergrowth. Mainstream history notes this shift. Jane Goodall moved from observer to communicator, from scientist to voice. Not everyone was pleased. Some academics grumbled that she blurred the line between science and storytelling, that she invited the public into a domain meant for scholars. Historians still argue whether her popular appeal advanced science or diluted it. But the truth was simpler. Jane's voice carried further than any academic journal could, and then her message began to widen. She saw that chimps weren't just endangered by predators or illness, but by humans' deforestation, poaching, habitat loss. The same hands that marveled at her discoveries were elsewhere cutting down forests and trapping chimps for trade. The joy of Gombe's stories carried with it a shadow. Jane could have stayed silent, safe within her notebooks, but she did not. She began to speak of conservation, of responsibility, of kinship. She urged people not just to admire chimps, but to protect them. Slowly, her voice became more than scientific, it became moral. Quirky detail: Jane was never a natural public speaker. Before her first big lecture, she was so nervous she wore gloves to hide her shaking hands. Imagine that this woman, who sat unflinching while chimps fought around her, suddenly trembling before rows of people. And yet, once she began to speak, the same calm patience flowed. She described the chimps as if they were family, and the audience softened, leaning in. The ripple of her words spread globally. Schools invited her. Governments listened, sometimes reluctantly. Conservation organizations formed around her message, and yet critics circled. Some accused her of sentimentality, once again saying her compassion diluted her science. Others insisted she exaggerated threats. Scholars still argue whether her role as activist compromised her neutrality. But Jane herself only smiled gently, saying, "If you spend years with beings you come to love, how could you not fight for them?" And you, sitting beside her in the forest, know the truth of it. The line between science and compassion is not so clear. The termite stick revealed intelligence. The banana exchange revealed trust. The stories revealed personality. And now, Jane reveals responsibility. The forest is not just a place to study, it is a place to protect. You watch the fire crackle, low sparks rising into the dark canopy. Jane closes her notebook, folds her hands, and leans back with a sigh. Tomorrow she will climb again, watch again, write again. But the voice she is finding is no longer just for her journal. It is for the world. Here's tonight's light joke. You can't help but think of how much more effective Jane was than your last attempt at persuading friends to recycle. She convinces governments to save forests. You can't even get someone to rinse a yogurt cup before tossing it in the bin. The night deepens. The forest hums. Jane sits quietly, her silhouette outlined by the glow of the fire. And you realize this is no longer only about chimps. This is about us all listening to the forest, remembering patience, and finding a voice gentle enough to carry through noise but strong enough to endure. By now, years have passed in Gombe. The chimps you first glimpsed as wary shadows have become familiar presences in your dreams. David Greybeard's calm gaze, Flo's patient hands. Flint's clinging cries, each one has etched themselves into history through Jane's quiet observations. But tonight, as you follow Jane beyond the forest, the story begins to expand. Gombe is no longer just a corner of Tanzania. It has become a window the whole world is peering through. Jane travels more often now. The notebooks and film reels that once felt fragile in her tent are transformed into lectures books and magazine covers. National Geographic runs spreads with her photographs, images that make living rooms across the globe pause in wonder. Readers see a chimp's hand clutching a twig, a mother grooming her child, a youngster, clambering onto a sibling's back, and suddenly it doesn't look so alien. It looks familiar. In conference halls, Jane takes the stage, slender, soft-voiced, often without notes. She tells her story as if you are sitting beside her under the trees, her words flowing gently, never rushed. And audiences lean forward, drawn in, not by authority, but by authenticity. She doesn't thunder. She soothes. You realize this is her secret. She speaks like the forest itself. Calm, patient, persistent. Mainstream history records this period as the time Jane Goodall shifted from researcher to public figure. And with that shift came tension. Some scientists grumbled that she was no longer objective, that her compassion for chimps blurred her judgment. Historians still argue whether Jane's fame diluted her science or carried it further than it ever could have gone on its own. Yet the truth was clear. Her message spread farther than journals or lectures confined to academia. Quirky detail: Jane once appeared on a children's television show, smiling warmly as she explained chimpanzees to curious kids. Imagine the world's leading primatologist gently answering a child's question about whether chimps like bananas as much as cartoons, suggest her patience never faltering. Even as adults in the audience probably rolled their eyes. Yet that was her genius. She took science out of ivory towers and placed it in living rooms and classrooms where it could grow roots. But the world she described was in danger. As the 1970s unfolded, deforestation crept closer. Poachers trapped chimps for meat or trade. The forests shrank, the cries of the chimps grew thinner, and Jane began to speak not only of behavior, but of survival. She insisted that the stories of Gombe were not just charming anecdotes, they were warnings. If humanity did not change course, the forests themselves would vanish, and with them, our kin. Her lectures took on urgency. She showed slides of clear-cut hillsides of chimps and cages of habitats destroyed. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered that she had become too political. Scholars still argue whether her activism blurred the line between science and advocacy. But Jane herself answered simply, "If you see destruction with your own eyes, how can you not speak?" Her voice reached further still. She founded the Jane Goodall Institute dedicated to research and conservation. She traveled tirelessly, speaking in cities, schools, villages, even parliaments. Sometimes she slept only a few hours a night, sustained by tea and determination. You imagine her suitcase perpetually half-packed her notebooks, tucked alongside worn clothes, her passport filled with stamps. And yet, despite the pace she carried with her, the same patience she once showed in Gombe. Each conversation was another twig dipped into a termite mound, small, precise building, slowly toward a meal of change. She didn't demand instant transformation. She believed in planting seeds, in letting trust grow, just as she had with the chimps. Here's tonight's light joke. You realize Jane's approach to changing the world is the opposite of how you deal with New Year's resolutions. She waits patiently for results. You give up on January 3rd when the gym runs out of towels. As you listen to her speak on stages far away from the forest, you feel the continuity. The same voice that soothed Flo's infant with quiet presence is now urging humans to remember their kinship with the natural world. The line from termite mound to United Nations podium is straighter than you'd expect. Both required patience, both required listening, both required the courage to see others as individuals. The night deepens in your mind, and the sound of insects fades into the hum of city crowds applauding. Jane bows slightly, her hair silvering with age, her smile gentle. She is no longer just the young woman on a ridge in Gombe. She is a voice for the planet, carrying the forest with her wherever she goes. The forest has changed since those early days. Paths once hidden are worn by footsteps, trees once young have grown broad, and the chimps Jane first watched have passed their children and grandchildren carrying on their stories. Yet the essence remains the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the drumming on hollow roots, the eyes watching from the branches above. You walk beside Jane now, not as the young woman with her notebook, but as the elder she has become, calm, silver-haired, her presence as steady as the lake itself. Her legacy stretches far beyond Gombe. Conservation programs run across Africa inspired by her institute. The Roots and Shoots program, begun with a handful of students, has spread to more than 100 countries, empowering young people to act with compassion for animals, people, and the environment. You smile at the thought of teenagers planting trees or cleaning rivers, carrying Jane's message in places she has never walked. Mainstream history now calls her one of the most influential environmental voices of the 20th and 21st centuries. Awards have been placed in her hands, degrees conferred, honors bestowed. Yet when asked, Jane insists her proudest achievement is not the medals, but the children who write to her saying, "Because of you, I want to help." Historians still argue whether her influence rests more in her science or in her advocacy. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps it is inseparable. Quirky detail: Jane has carried Jubilee, her childhood stuffed chimpanzee, for decades. Faded threadbare, his stitched smile, crooked Jubilee sits quietly in her home, a reminder that great legacies can begin with small dreams. You chuckle softly, imagining visitors staring in awe at awards and diplomas, only to be told that the real treasure is an old toy chimp. As you wander with her through memory, you notice the pattern: patience, gentleness, and observation repeated again and again like ripples in the lake. Jane did not rush. She did not force. She simply waited, listened, and recorded. And from that quietness, a revolution bloomed. Now the night deepens. You hear once more the calls of chimps, distant yet familiar, carrying across the hills like echoes of an ancient kinship. The line between human and animal has blurred, not erased, but softened like mist settling over water. You close your eyes and feel Jane's message settle with it, that every life matters, that compassion is as scientific as curiosity, that patience can change the world. And so you rest, carried by the forest, soothed by the rhythm of her legacy. The story of Jane Goodall does not end. It lingers, a whisper of leaves, a gaze of dark eyes, a hand reaching for a twig. And now, as our journey together draws to a close, let the sounds of Gombe soften in your imagination. The forest grows quieter, the calls of chimpanzees fading into a distant lull. The air is warm, the leaves above shifting gently, as if they are tucking you in beneath a canopy, woven from patience and time. You breathe slowly in and out, letting each breath carry away the tension of the day. The story we have followed Jane Goodall's patience, her gentle observations, her unshakable belief that compassion belongs alongside science, can rest with you now like a blanket of calm. The details remain, of course, David Greybeard dipping his twig into the termite mound, Flo cradling Flint with maternal care, the forest itself whispering its endless rhythm. But the urgency has faded. Only the softness remains. Imagine lying on the edge of Lake Tanganyika, the moon mirrored in the still water. The stars above shimmer faintly, their light stretched across centuries, a reminder that history is long and wide, and your place within it is steady and small. The insects hum quietly, the night breeze drifts against your skin, and the world feels slower, safer, quieter. Each sound you remember, the rustle of grass, the drumming of chimps on roots. Even the scratch of Jane's pencil across her notebook melts now into background music, as calming as the soft hum of a fan in your room. You are no longer in the forest. You are simply resting, floating on a story that has carried you gently from childhood dreams to lasting legacy. So let your eyes close fully now. Let your body grow heavy, and let sleep carry you the way the forest carries its secrets, slowly, quietly, patiently. End of script. Sweet dreams.